This is the second video on the GDP. And in this, now that we've learned what the GDP is about, we're going to look at the limitations of the GDP. This is important because GDP and growth, which means an increase in the GDP, is what people use as a measure for whether the economy is doing well, which in turn it means that all of our economic policy is focused on growing the GDP. So if your policy is going to do that, let's see whether that's doing what you want it to accomplish. Now, some of the limits of the GDP are as follows. One is that the GDP just looks at what's produced, new final goods and services. You can produce anything. It could be a good or it could be a bad. You could be producing vaccines. You could be producing pornography. It doesn't matter. I'll count it all in the GDP. So that means I can have a very high GDP, but I might not be producing the things that contribute to people's well-being. So I've got to be careful about that. Next, GDP doesn't look at how the stuff I produced was produced. It's just going to measure cars. It's not going to measure whether these cars are fuel efficient or not, right? It's not going to measure the production process, whether or not there was a high carbon footprint or a low carbon footprint when the car was produced. So what this means is it doesn't pay attention to the technology I'm using, doesn't pay attention to whether the technology is sort of ruining the earth or making things better. So that's one thing. The GDP is a total number, so it doesn't look at for whom I am producing. So let me give you an example. In one country, two people, one guy has $10, the other fellow has $90. 10 plus 90 produced 100. GDP is 100. In another country, one person produced 40, one person gets 40, the other person gets 60. 40 plus 60 is also 100. But so you see that GDP pays no attention to distribution or equity. It doesn't look at who we're producing for and who the production benefits. And in particular, there are two areas that have emerged as deep policy concerns in terms of the limits of the GDP. The GDP makes no accounting for environmental degradation. So if I produce something, I will count the product, but I will not take account of whether or not the environment was spoiled, whether there was an oil spill, whether there was deforestation, whether people were getting poisoned in the water supply. So no accounting for the environment. So the environment is absent in the GDP. So you can imagine, for example, how decades of economic policy focusing on the GDP without any attention to the environment has brought us to a position where we are now very worried about climate change and what's going to happen. And GDP does not pay attention to unpaid labor because it's only paying attention to things that are produced in and for the market. This is a real problem when it comes to gender, because what this means is unpaid labor in the home. All the work that is done, usually by women, childcare, cooking, cleaning, laundry, all that, which is production, it just disappears. Which means we get the image that women aren't producing anything, because it's all completely invisible in the GDP. So this takes us back to our concept of invisibility, how we notice numbers, and what numbers can and cannot tell us. So this is our work for this class. When you come to class, make sure you've done the readings and the videos. We are going to be actually doing some examples and doing some calculations around the GDP. I also want you to make sure that you watch the video by Marilyn Waring. Give yourself some time for that. It is a long video, and do give yourself some time because she has a very thick accent. So you need to be sure you attune yourself to that. You don't need to watch the whole video. I will note in the reading how far you can watch, necessary, but if you want, if you're interested, you can watch the whole video. Next week, we will ask the question, if this is the problem, then what can we do? Thank you.